December 1944. The Ardennes forest. Snow on frozen ground. A classified field report lands on a desk at the War Department in Washington. The handwriting belongs to General George Patton. His words are blunt, almost casual. The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. Funny fuse. 2 words scribbled like a private joke. But behind that nickname sits a billion-dollar secret. One of the most expensive weapons programs of the entire war, second only to the atomic bomb itself. For nearly 2 years, the United States had hidden this weapon from every battlefield where it might fall into enemy hands. A miniature radar set, small enough to fit inside an artillery shell. It detected the ground as the shell descended. It triggered detonation at precisely 30 feet above the surface, the optimal height for maximum fragmentation. No impact, no burial in soft earth, no wasted energy. Shrapnel raining straight down into foxholes and trenches. Positions that had offered reasonable protection for 4 years of war, suddenly worthless. The documents say 5 to 10 times more lethal than conventional artillery against dug-in infantry. 5 to 10 times. But the fuse is only half the story, because the weapon that terrified German soldiers in the Ardennes wasn't just a clever piece of engineering stuffed inside a shell casing. It was the final piece of a system built quietly over years, in places no intelligence service thought to look. A system that German analysts would spend months trying to decode after the war, writing report after report, unable to explain what had happened to them. Patton called it a funny fuse. German infantry had a different name for what it did. They had no name. They had never encountered anything like it. How did the Americans build a weapon their enemy couldn't even imagine? And why did nobody see it coming? In 1939, a stack of intelligence assessments circulated through Berlin's military planning offices. German analysts had compiled a thorough evaluation of every major army on Earth. Their conclusion about the United States was consistent across every report. The American army ranked 19th in the world, smaller than Portugal's, smaller than Romania's. The assessment was not wrong. It was based on observable facts, troop numbers, equipment inventories, training reports. By every measurable standard, the United States fielded a negligible ground force. Adolf Hitler's own analysis went further. In his framework, national strength flowed from racial purity and cultural unity. America, a nation of immigrants from every corner of the globe, could not possibly produce soldiers to match the Wehrmacht. The logic was circular, but it was deeply held. And then there was the evidence. February 1943, Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The first major engagement between American and German ground forces. Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps struck an untested American corps under Major General Lloyd Friedendahl. The result was not a defeat. It was a collapse. 6,500 American casualties in 6 days, 3,000 captured. Units pushed back over 50 miles. Soldiers abandoned equipment. Officers lost contact with their commands. Rommel's assessment, filed shortly after, the Americans had not yet learned how to fight. Other German generals were less generous in their private notes. They expected future encounters to produce similar results, with similar ease. The intelligence picture seemed complete. A large industrial nation, yes, capable of producing trucks and canned rations in enormous quantities, but as a fighting force, soft, disorganized, predictable. Every file in Berlin confirmed it. Every analyst agreed. But here is where the record fractures. Because something had already begun to change, not on any battlefield the Germans were watching, but in a quiet artillery school on the Oklahoma plains. and no one in German intelligence was paying attention. Fort Sill, Oklahoma. The years between the wars. While most nations slashed military budgets, a small group of artillery officers worked on a problem that no one else considered urgent. The problem was coordination. In every army on Earth, artillery operated through direct relationships. An observer called fire from his assigned battery. If he needed guns from another unit, the request climbed a bureaucratic chain. Minutes bled away. Targets moved. Opportunities died. The system developed at Fort Sill inverted this entirely. They called it the Fire Direction Center. Any observer, anywhere on the battlefield, could call for fire from any battery in range. No prior relationship required. Requests passed upward, battalion to division to corps, with a speed that no other army could match. 3 minutes. From a radio call in a muddy foxhole to shells landing on target. 3 minutes. The German equivalent took 10 to 12. That speed was only the first layer. The second was a technique with a clinical name: time on target. Batteries of different calibers, positioned at varying distances, calculated their firing sequences so that every shell from every gun arrived simultaneously, within a window of seconds. For soldiers in the impact zone, silence, then instantaneous saturation. No ranging shot, no first shell to send men diving for cover before the barrage began. The full weight of massed artillery arriving in a single, unified instant. This was not a weapon. It was a system. And systems don't appear in intelligence photographs. They don't show up in equipment catalogs. A German analyst studying American artillery pieces would see competent but unremarkable guns. The revolution was invisible, buried in fire control charts, radio procedures, and mathematical tables. No intelligence service on Earth was looking for a procedural innovation at an artillery school in Oklahoma. The Americans had built something that couldn't be seen until it was already killing. Kasserine should have been a warning. Instead, it became a trap, not for the Americans, but for German intelligence. The paradox is visible in the after-action reports. Rommel wrote that the Americans would require months, perhaps years, to develop into serious opponents. His fellow commanders agreed. They had seen the Americans at their worst moment. They assumed they had seen the Americans at their normal level. This is the structure of a perfect deception. Except no one planned it. The Americans didn't intend Kasserine as misdirection. They genuinely lost. Friedendahl's command was genuinely incompetent. The panic was real. The casualties were real. The humiliation was real. But the German conclusion that this represented a fixed ceiling of American capability was catastrophically wrong. Within weeks of Kasserine, the American command structure underwent radical surgery. Friedendahl was relieved. Patton took command of the Second Corps, and at El Guitar in March 1943, the Germans encountered something entirely new. Not just more guns, something systematic, something coordinated in ways German artillery had never achieved. The speed of fire, the precision of massing, the elimination of dead time between request and impact. German intelligence officers who analyzed El Guitar struggled to explain what had happened. The speed of improvement defied every model they possessed for estimating enemy capabilities. Armies don't transform in weeks. Except this one did. Even Rommel, in a later assessment, conceded the shift. Even at that time, the American generals showed themselves to be very advanced in the tactical handling of their forces. But the concession came too late, buried in a private document. The institutional assessment in Berlin didn't change. The file on American fighting capacity remained largely unrevised. The Germans were now operating on intelligence that was outdated before the ink dried. And the Americans were about to get better again. June 6, 1944, Normandy. The terrain itself became a weapon, but against the attackers. The bocage, ancient hedgerows, root systems centuries old, dense enough to stop a Sherman tank. Every field a fortress, every lane an ambush corridor. American armor, designed for open warfare, ground to a halt in a landscape that negated every advantage of mobility and firepower. German defenders knew this terrain intimately. Field Marshal von Rundstedt built his entire Western strategy around it. Screen off the British sector around Caen. Concentrate mobile reserves against the Americans, where the hedgerows would bleed them dry. The strategy was sound. Against a different enemy, it might have worked. Then a sergeant changed the equation. Curtis Cullen, 2nd Armored Division, studied the German beach obstacles, steel rails welded into crosses to rip open landing craft, scrap metal. He welded salvaged pieces onto the front of a Sherman tank. The device cut through hedgerow root systems like a plow through soil. General Omar Bradley saw a demonstration. He ordered immediate mass production. Within 3 weeks, 3 out of 5 tanks in 1st Army mounted hedgerow cutters. Ordnance units fabricated them around the clock. The device was kept strictly secret from German intelligence. July 25th, Operation Cobra, the breakout. Tanks that had been trapped for weeks poured through the bocage. The German defensive model, built on the assumption that the hedgerows would hold, collapsed in days. Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzerlehr, wrote 20 separate drafts trying to describe what happened to his division. Von Rundstedt, interrogated after the war, admitted the core failure plainly. He was never certain what the Americans would do until they were already doing it. But even Cobra was not the final variable. The most expensive secret of the war had still not been deployed on the ground. It was waiting. December 16th, 1944. Hitler launched his last gamble through the Ardennes. The offensive rested on an assumption carried forward from Kasserine, nearly 2 years old now. American soldiers would crumble under a determined surprise assault. Hitler still believed the Americans were fundamentally soft. The first hours seemed to confirm it. Green divisions buckled, units scattered. The 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne. Brigadier General Anthony McCullough's reply to the German surrender demand, "Nuts," entered the record. Then the system activated. Patton's 3rd Army executed one of the war's greatest feats. An entire army, over 100,000 men, pivoted 90 degrees northward. They advanced more than 100 miles through winter conditions. They relieved Bastogne on December 26th. But it was at Elsenborn Ridge that the hidden weapon finally emerged. 348 artillery pieces massed against the 6th SS Panzer Army. And for the first time on a ground battlefield, the shells carried proximity fuses. The air above German positions became a ceiling of steel fragments. Shells that would normally have buried themselves in snow and frozen earth before exploding now detonated at 30 feet. Shrapnel cascaded downward into foxholes, into trenches, into every position that had ever offered shelter. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Youth, advanced into that storm. Their tanks burned where they stopped. The advance stalled. Then it broke. German prisoners captured during the Bulge reported something that appears in multiple interrogation transcripts. Some soldiers charged directly into American positions rather than endure the airburst fire. They preferred the chance of being shot in a direct assault to the certainty of being shredded by fragments from above while cowering in their holes. Patton's report to the War Department carried no emotion, just data. The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. We caught a German battalion trying to get across the Sour River with a battalion concentration and killed by actual count 702. The secret was out. The proximity fuse was not a single breakthrough. It was the final component in a machine that had been assembling itself since the quiet years at Fort Sill. Consider what converged at Elsenborn Ridge, the Fire Direction Center, allowing any forward observer to summon fire from any battery in range within 3 minutes. Time on target, synchronizing hundreds of guns so their shells arrived in a single simultaneous wave. And now, the proximity fuse, ensuring that each of those shells detonated at the precise altitude for maximum lethality. Each element alone was formidable. Together, they created something no army had ever faced. A forward observer spots a German column. His radio call reaches the Fire Direction Center. Within minutes, batteries across miles of front calculate their sequences. Shells arc through winter air from different distances, different calibers, converging on a single grid coordinate at a single moment. And every shell detonates 30 feet above the ground. No warning shot, no time to react, no cover that works. By March 1945, when the Ninth Army crossed the Rhine, the system operated at industrial scale. 2,700 artillery pieces fired simultaneously. More than 65,000 rounds in approximately 1 hour. Over 1,000 shells per minute falling on German positions across the river. Battery C of the 337th Field Artillery Battalion, a single battery, fired 300,000 rounds between June 1944 and March 1945. German intelligence officers wrote their after-action analyses. They cataloged American guns, counted batteries, measured calibers. They could describe the components. They could not explain the system. Because the system was not a piece of hardware that could be captured and reverse engineered. It was doctrine, training, communication architecture, and mathematical coordination, built over decades and invisible to any intelligence method that counted equipment. The German generals spoke after the war. Their testimony fills hundreds of pages of interrogation transcripts. The consistency is striking. General Gunther Blumentritt, choosing his words with care. We regarded General Patton extremely highly as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, a man of incredible initiative and lightning-like action. Panzer General, a German tank commander's highest compliment, given to an American. Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg itself, was more precise. I hear much about General Patton. He conducted a good campaign. From the standpoint of a tank specialist, I must congratulate him on his victory, since he acted as I would have done had I been in his place. These are not courtesy statements. These are professional assessments from men who had spent their careers studying armored warfare. Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations for the German High Command, located the exact fracture point. The war was already lost in the West at the time of the breakthrough and the beginning of the War of Movement in France. Not the Bulge, not the Rhine crossing, France. The moment the hedgerows broke and Patton's armor poured through, the strategic equation became unsolvable. The army that fled at Kasserine in February 1943 became the army that no German force could stop by the summer of 1944. The transformation took 16 months. German intelligence never updated its core assessment to account for this rate of change. The models said armies don't evolve that fast. The models were wrong. And the weapon they feared most, the one that turned winter foxholes into open graves, had been waiting in storage for 2 years before anyone allowed it onto a battlefield. The question that opened this record, who was deceiving whom, resolves with an uncomfortable clarity. No American intelligence officer planted false reports about U.S. weakness. No deception operation fed Berlin the assessment that American soldiers were soft. The Germans built that conclusion themselves, from real evidence, interpreted through assumptions they never questioned. Kasserine was real. The defeat was genuine. But the conclusion drawn from it, that American capability had a fixed ceiling, was the most consequential intelligence failure of the Western Front. Meanwhile, the Americans hid in plain sight. An artillery system developed at a peacetime army school, a hedgerow cutter welded from scrap metal by a sergeant, a billion-dollar radar fuse held back from combat until the moment it mattered most. None of it was invisible. All of it was overlooked. Patton's funny fuse, that casual, almost dismissive nickname, carried inside it a miniature radar, a decade of doctrinal innovation, and the complete miscalculation of an enemy who never looked past its own assumptions. The fuse detonated at 30 feet. The intelligence failure had no altitude at all. It was buried so deep in the foundations of German strategic thinking that no single report, no single battle, no single captured shell could have dislodged it. The Americans they met at Kasserine were not the Americans who broke the Wehrmacht, but the Germans kept fighting the army they remembered, not the army that existed. That was the real deception, and no one had to plan it.